Thank you, Nancy. As Zoom is prompting us, the meeting is being recorded, so I will be starting today's session. Hello, and welcome to today's Globe Talk in honor of World Social Work Day. World Social Work Day is on March 21st. So we are excited to begin having conversations around social work and hear from one of our very own experts. This session is brought to you by TCS Global Engagement. TCS education system and our schools are committed to preparing innovative, engaged, purposeful agents of change who serve our global community. Our global engagement team works to bring this mission to life by providing leadership, infrastructure, and support for internationalization throughout the TCS community. We're passionate about creating learning opportunities that have a positive impact on our global community. Our Globe Talk series is a part of our mission and provide virtual year-round discussions to introduce our community to thought leaders in higher education, experts on key functional areas, best practices, and the diversity and delivery of thought necessary to expand our own internal strategic thinking. Before we begin today's Globe Talk, we would like to go over a few tips for best assessing today's session. We ask that you please mute yourself during today's session, but feel free to use the chat box and reaction throughout. We also recommend keeping your video off in the interest of conserving bandwidth. As the speaker is presenting, we will be monitoring the chat box. We do have a lot of time for Q&As at the end of the session, but feel free to post your questions and comments throughout the talk. We also request your patience. Technology can be a challenge, and we'll do our best. Should there be any issues, all Globe Talks are recorded and available after the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our featured speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ivania Delgado. Dr. Delgado has over 15 years of teaching experience in higher education and recently joined Pacific Coast College as a core social work faculty member. Her pedagogy is grounded in social justice, collaboration, and compassion. Before entering academia full-time, Dr. Delgado spent the previous 15 years working with individuals, couples, families, and groups in both public and private sectors in Miami-Dade County. Providing trauma-informed mental health services, she's a proud mother, partner, daughter, and community member. Thank you so much for being our featured speaker today. Now, without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Delgado. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Hola, hola, buenos días, buenas tardes, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here today. I'm always thrilled and excited to highlight and discuss Ignacio Martin Barro's liberation psychology. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Sharon, for all of the support that you've provided me throughout this endeavor. Okay. So again, my name is Ivania Delgado, and I use she, her, ella pronouns. And I am presenting from the lands of the Seminole and Miccosukee, and historically the Calusa and Tequesta, also known as Miami, the 305. And with more specificity, La Pequeña Habana. So thank you for joining me again. I do tend to follow different rhythms. And I want to say that I wanted to start with the references because it's really important for me to honor the lived experiences and scholarship of the people that have inspired me and have shaped and influenced more beyond how I practice and how I study and how I teach, but my worldview. And I just want to highlight a couple of these that I could not do this presentation without. So A People's History of Psychoanalysis, from Freud to Liberation Psychology, the role of social work in Black liberation, in the Journal of the Black Scholar, Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks, Ignacio Martin Baro, Writings for Liberation Psychology, Social Justice and Clinical Practice, a Liberation Health Framework, and this is Don Martinez, and Recordando Ignacio Martin Baro, and Toward Psychologies of Liberation, and of course, La lucha y la vida de mi abuela y mi padre, que en paz descansen, my grandmother and my father's life and struggle that definitely is with me, continues to be with me throughout my days. And I expect that that is the case forever. All right. So I want to do a brief check-in activity. I would love for us to take 15, 20 seconds to look at the image that you have in front of you. There is concrete, there's a flower, there's a white flower. And if we can take 20 seconds to just kind of reflect on it, and I would love for us to use the chat. If you can drop in a feeling or a thought that comes up for you as you're looking at this image and maybe reflecting on it. I'll give you 15 seconds. Thank you for your generous participation. Absolutely. Sometimes I don't have the full language to describe what liberation theories and practices and models have done for the way that I've lived my own life. And so what we've just done together is create language together of what liberation psychology has to offer and the promises of potential possibility and transformation that it actually does provide. And so absolutely, you know, liberation psychology cannot be divorced and separated from the oppressive conditions that it was birthed from. And so there was someone that said, it's peace and beauty in the hard times. So you're naming both things. Look how peaceful this looks and look how beautiful it is. Look how it is striving to survive and to live another day and to fight to live another day. Look how it's getting its nurturance from the sun, from the light, but there are hard times. So you've named both things that are present in this. And this captures just the sentiment of how I feel about liberation psychology. I also see other words that resonate with me. Fuerte, fuerza, peace, peace, hope, resilience, growth. Absolutely. So thank you so much for your generous participation, determination, hope. Yeah. Wonderful. So why liberation psychology, a testimonio? So I want to share with you that a couple of things that I experienced as a student really, you know, I desired so much to be able to make connections about the people that I served in my own community, but also about myself and the places, you know, and the place that I come from. And I did not feel like this was present in the lesson planning and the curriculum and the textbooks. So I spent many years learning, but hearing about the deficits that existed in Central American people. So my own background is that my family is from Nicaragua, Central America. And so we, you know, obviously the services that were going to be provided were services for individuals that are political refugees, individuals that are seeking asylum, individuals that were undocumented in the community. And so, you know, a lot of the conversation or conceptualizations around this population were about the deficits, right? What they did not have. Some of those explanations were also, so just focusing on the intrapsychological experiences, a lot of the behavioral manifestations being conceptualized as maybe moral failures or poor decision-making or poor planning or poor organizational skills or not being able to prioritize. There was a lot of conversation, I remember, about learned helplessness and external controls, but never really fully naming the social structures and the oppressive conditions and the role that that has on mental health, particularly of people that are displaced, people that are marginalized, people that are under-resourced, and being forced by many different forces to have to leave their home countries. And so these were, you know, these were things that often left me feeling just not okay with the way that we were conducting some of these studies and conceptualizations and just thinking about applying interventions to these communities. And so why liberation psychology? When I come across liberation psychology, all of a sudden, you know, it starts shifting the focus from just the intrapsychological experiences, but bridging the micro with the macro level explanations. And just understanding how important it is to learn about the history of countries, to understand the factors that contribute to the presenting problem, such as social economic factors, political factors, historical factors, and relationships between countries. So having an international lens, understanding that, you know, the role that, you know, for example, having sanctions on a particular country. What does sanctions do to an entire group of people who can no longer possibly buy certain products, feed their families in a particular way? And so now they need to make decisions of having to leave everything that they call home, everything that, you know, they call family. So liberation psychology just offered me a more empowering, a more complete conceptualization. And it was something that definitely changed my life. So that is why, right? I'm going to start the conversation with a poem, and then we're going to uncover Martin Baro in his context, which is El Salvador. And in El Salvador, there was a civil war. And again, I can't really talk about liberation psychology without talking about the conditions that he lived under and that he observed and that he offered testimony on and that he died for. And we will also look at the influence of liberation theology, naming Monsignor Oscar Romero as well. We're going to talk about challenging dominant epistemologies, which is the major critique of Ignacio Martín Baró, the urgent tasks that he proposed that needed to happen in the field of psychology. But again, this was something that he thought everyone should be doing. Educators, right? Religious figures. He himself was a Jesuit priest. All of the different, you know, ways that one gets involved with human beings and understanding human development. And of course, conscientización, which is critical consciousness raising. I do want to offer you content warning. There will be mention of historical trauma, imperialism, war trauma, and multiple systems of oppression, including racism. Two of the folks that I'm going to be discussing today were assassinated. And so there are going to be, I guess I ask you, the participant, to practice discernment, right? If this is something that is uncomfortable, I want you to know that I am uncomfortable. I am always uncomfortable when I'm discussing human suffering and oppression. And I expect to stay uncomfortable because that means that I am emotionally invested and I want to see a better world. However, this may be triggering for some folks, and that is when you, as the expert of you, needs to decide if this is something that you may want to skip. So this poem is by Pablo Neruda, and I'm just going to read the first part. And it's to set the tone, right? Again, in the spirit of Ignacio Martín Baró, I cannot separate the social, economic, and political factors and historical factors from the theory. They are enmeshed, and this is what this is what happened. So it's called the United Fruit Company. When the trumpet sounded, everything was prepared on earth, and Jehovah gave the world to Coca-Cola, Anaconda, Ford Motors, and other corporations. The United Fruit Company reserved for itself the most juicy piece, the central coast of my world, the delicate waste of America. Cuando sonó la trompeta, estuvo todo preparado en la tierra, y Jehová repartió el mundo a Coca-Cola, Anaconda, Ford Motors y otras entidades. La compañía frutera se reservó lo más jugoso, la costa central de mi tierra, la dulce cintura de América. Okay. So Ignacio Martín Baró was born on November 7th, 1942 in Spain. And a lot of the people that worked with him, his colleagues, his friends, his students, they called him Nacho. They described him as someone who was friendly, who was humorous, who was kind, who was humble. And in many interviews that I've seen of people that try to highlight his life and his work, people still think about him, right? So when they're thinking about why are people doing the things that they're doing, why is society in such conditions? I saw a woman from El Salvador say, I still ask him, I say, Nacho, what would you do? And I thought, wow, that's, his legacy is definitely inspirational. One of the things that I want to say about his work is that in many texts, he is described as the person who coined liberation psychology. However, I fully recognize that the work of liberation is global. And then, that there are many, liberation doesn't belong to one person, to one people's. And you can see the tenets of liberation, of identifying the structural, of identifying the institutional, of naming multiple systems of oppression and how multiple systems of oppression can live in one person, compounding that experience. That's a global affair. So there are things that his work definitely offers me, but that it is something, I don't find all the answers here, right? All the answers are not here. I definitely needed to look elsewhere for liberation theory and intervention that particularly highlights, for example, the trans life experience, the Black experience within the borders of the United States. So I say this to say that there's more than one psychology, and I think that he would even be in alignment with that spirit because he was always challenging the lack of epistemologies available to students to be able to understand specifically the geopolitical areas that they existed in. So anyway, he was born in 1942. He traveled to El Salvador in 1960. In one of the interviews, he says, I didn't choose El Salvador. I was asked in my becoming a Jesuit priest, in my training, I was asked to do work in Central America. And so he ended up in El Salvador. So he didn't himself, pick El Salvador to go there. He studied humanities in Ecuador in 1961. He studied philosophy and literature in Colombia. He studied theology in Germany and Belgium in 1970. And he studied psychology in El Salvador. I want to say he received his bachelor's degree in El Salvador. His graduate degrees, including a PhD in 1979 from the University of Chicago. He then traveled back to El Salvador in 1979. And he became the board of directors at La UCA, which is the university. He was part of the editorial board. He founded the University Institute of Public Opinion. And I'm going to pause right there because this is really important. One of the things that he was doing with the Institute of Public Opinion was that they are in the middle of this war, right? And there are a lot of things that are happening. And one of the things that are happening is that the United States was providing aid and weapons to the military. And so, he had many thoughts around this idea, but he understood that there was a narrative, a dominant narrative being presented to the world about what El Salvador wanted. And so this makes me think tremendously about Noam Chomsky, right? So Noam Chomsky has manufacturing consent. And so in manufacturing consent, he talks about the different lenses that one can take to examine, to critically think around the information that is being presented to us through mainstream medias. And so what he did was that he started developing surveys, and he took these surveys to the pueblos, to the different villages and the different communities, so that through these surveys, he would be able to demonstrate what the public, what the people's public opinion around the repression and violent repressions and that were happening in El Salvador. And what he did with this information was not only did he publish it academically, but he made it available to the public through news media. And so part of what he was always encouraging and empowering was that folks used criticality to engage with what is real, and are we being given the real story? So, unlayering all of these things. And so, of course, that was controversial, and it was him, being involved in the politics of, what is common sense in regards to the war that was happening in El Salvador. And so one of the things that I want to say to that is that there's an interview of him discussing psychology with other American psychologists. And he says, for you, North American psychologists, it's either you publish or you perish. Our social, economic, political conditions are that if I publish, I perish. Right, in El Salvador because of the war conditions. And so, that is what I think he did best. He was always challenging our notions of universalism, our notions of teaching in a way that is ahistorical and apolitical, and removing all context as if, as if my human experience is the same as yours, and that of course there's other things to unveil there. If we are presenting the human experience as universal, whose human experience is universal? And so there's a lot of stuff to discuss there. And so I really wanted to highlight what he did with the Institute of Public Opinion. He was also the head of the psychology department. He was a visiting professor in Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, Spain, and he visited Nicaragua in 1988. He was the vice president of Central American Division of Inter-American Society of Psychology. And they actually, on their page, if you visit the organization's page, they have a full section just for him. They have his brothers talking. They have his dissertation chair in the University of Chicago talking about the work that she did with him. So they have this whole section just dedicated to him. And like I mentioned, limitations are, of course, that there's many perspectives that are not, or at least in my humble studying of his work, that I have not encountered. But that I am okay with that. I am flexible with that. I remain fluid, and I just seek out other people's work for those missing pieces. And I wanted to say one thing. One would think, wow, he was born in 1942. He comes from Spain. He dives into the work that he's doing in Central America. And in the next slide, I have that he was, of course, assassinated. He's one of those, the 6 Jesuit priests that was assassinated in El Salvador by US trained military. And one would think, well, how do we go from living in Spain to being this person who is has preference over the folks that live in poverty, who is getting, involved so politically. How do we go from there? And one of the things that I wanted to share that I thought was meaningful, I haven't found more information on it, but I would love to know how this played a role. So his father's name was Paco, and Paco was a journalist in Spain, and he was someone who was conservative and someone who supported Francisco Franco during the time period of what they call Franco Spain. And so if you know a little bit about Franco Spain, you know that this is also described as a period of brutal dictatorship and fascism. And so his father supported that. There was an incident with his father where through his journalism, he challenged something regarding Franco, and he was sanctioned. So even his father, who was conservative and supported that government, he was sanctioned himself. So I often sit here and wonder and think, gosh, right? I wonder how much of seeing that level of violence and brutality and repression and all of the things that happened in the universities in Spain during that time period, how much of that maybe seeped in, and he said, I know this, I recognize these patterns, let me get involved. So I just wanted to take a moment as well to name the 6 Jesuit priests that were murdered, and as well as a person that was working there and her daughter. It's Ignacio Ellacuria, Ignacio Martín Baró, Segundo Montes, Juan Ramón Moreno, Joaquín López y López, Amando López, Elba Ramos, y Selena Ramos. So here, the little flickering star, this is El Salvador, right? This is El Salvador, where he was. He was murdered on November 16th, 1989. It is known that his last words, he recited in the university. So this happened inside the university. And his last words were, "This is an injustice." And so where this happened was Universidad Centroamericana José Simón Canas, La UCA, and this was done by US trained troops of the elite Atlaca, I cannot say that word, battalion. And so these are some of those things that we need to reckon with when we are discussing these kinds of histories. And that's why it's so important to encourage that global lens, that international lens, so that we can make connections about what is happening at that level that also impacts the micro level experience of living in certain spaces. So the US Army, there's some noise, hold on. Sorry, I was muting someone. So we know that these were US trained troops, and they were trained in the US Army Training Center, which is also called the School of the Americas, and it is known for training some of Latin America's worst human rights violators. So Ignacio Martín Baró was absolutely inspired by liberation theology, obviously being a Jesuit himself. And inspiration of liberation theology is that this is a practice of religious faith by supporting the poor and oppressed, and through action in political and civic affairs. So they actually thought it was part, right, of their duty to be politically involved, to ensure that they are connected to the communities that they serve, and that they honored the health, the social, economic needs of the people that they served. And so I of course, Ignacio Martín Baró also wrote a book where he talks about Oscar Romero and all of the things that Oscar Romero did for his people. And so I thought what best representation of liberation theology in El Salvador than to ask you to maybe do some research on your own of Oscar Arnulfo Romero y Galdames, who was born in August 15, 1917, and he was also assassinated March 24th, 1980. Again, think about the idea of when Ignacio Martín Baró said, if I publish, I perish. So Oscar Romero, el Monseñor Oscar Romero, he gradually, he became more involved in calling out the military, calling out the way that the United States was providing some of this aid in the form of weapons, in the form of training people, and in the form of money, of course. So there is a very famous letter that Oscar Romero wrote to the United States administration asking to please stop, right? Please stop because the people are dying. And there's a piece of the letter here on this PowerPoint. And it says, I'm not going to read it all, but I'm just going to read a quick snippet. It says, in these moments, we are living through a grave economic and political crisis in our country, but it is certain that increasingly the people are awakening and organizing and have begun to prepare themselves to manage and be responsible for the future of El Salvador as the only ones capable of overcoming the crisis, as the only ones capable of overcoming the crisis, basically saying, this is up to the people. They have it within them to create the country in the conditions that they want to see fit. And in the rest of the letter, it's basically all of the things that you know, if you do this, this is what you're robbing the people of, right? Apart from the fact that, of course, there was massive death in this country, in El Salvador. So some of the things that Ignacio Martín Baró took away from liberation theology included true practice over true theory. So what one does is more expressive than what one says. Preferential option for folks living in poverty. They said, it says in the writings, you know, this was Jesus' first choice, right? So that in itself says that this is what we should be doing. The second thing is that they saw that salvation would happen bottom up, so that the salvation of the folks that are living in poverty would save everybody else. And so these are some of the concepts that come from liberation theology that I see in Ignacio Martín Baró's writing. And he says, you know, what we can get from here are three things. It's a push for a new horizon, that psychology, education, the helping professions should maybe shift their focus a bit from scientific validity and the status of the professions to maybe focusing on what are the needs of the people and how can we use our science, our methodology, our practices to transform those realities around us. A new epistemology. And under a new epistemology, he said, let's redesign theoretical and practical tools from the standpoint of the lives of people. Many folks here know that a lot of research has been done from perspectives of those folks that may be considered part of the dominant group and not from the perspectives. So they're studying people or power over people, and not with the people or from the people, right? So this is an explicit ask of participatory type of research, community participatory research, so that redesigning these theoretical and practical tools from the standpoint of the lives of the people. And a new praxis, right? The new praxis is, let's not just do the research, let's not just do the studying, but how are we going to use what we have learned to change the lives, to change particularly the material conditions, because there is something to say about, you know, including other voices into a narrative, but that it has no impact on the material conditions of the people. And I think that also needs to be part of it. So here are the main critiques that Ignacio Martín Baró had of models in psychology. Number one is positivism, so that knowledge should be limited to positive facts, events, to their empirically verifiable locations. So that hyper focus on the things that are real are the things that are measurable, and the things that are real are the things that we can do in the lab. And just centering. And I don't think he's saying throw away this knowledge, by the way. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's, let's make space for the metaphysical. Let's make space for the variety of ways that people have human experiences, and that there is validity in that as well. If we can just, make space for them. So having multiple epistemologies is huge here. The fact that a lot of models are focused on individualism, so that the individual is the final subject of psychology. And so he's asking, we got to make room for not just individual liberation, because of course he says psychology has always made room for, in the here and now, for people to be able to have control over their thoughts and feelings, emotional regulation, perception, intellectual functioning and study and what have you. But what about collective liberation, right? So not just individual liberation, but what about that connection to the societal and collective liberation of a people? Hedonism. So he felt that a lot of models in psychology, it almost presented as if the outcome is about wellness or happiness or just having pleasure and satisfaction in your life. And it didn't really, I guess the way that I understood it is there's very little value in the values of self-sacrifice, right? Or pathologizing things like suffering and self-sacrifice. Because when he would talk about the people from El Salvador, he acknowledged how brave they were, how if they had, one meal, they would self-sacrifice their own needs to share this meal with 3 other people, and how they were willing to put their lives on the line for the betterment of a community. And so he felt that there wasn't, that if anything, sometimes these things may be pathologized under different lenses, staying within that intrapsychic. Along with that, I want to say that he also challenged the notion that all activity was in the search for pleasure. So altruism, right? So I think we've all discussed how, or we've all heard maybe folks talk about altruism as something that always has some sort of self-satisfaction that one is gaining. So he had a lot of questions around that, but that there was definitely tremendous focus on, going to therapy maybe for the goal of being happy in the here and the now, totally decontextualized and not considering other things that may be needed at that moment. Homeostatic vision. So the idea that if there's crisis, it's pathologized versus looking at crisis as an opportunity for transformation, for change, for digging deep, for extracting wisdom through the trauma. And so he said, this distrust of change and disequilibrium versus the possibility of transformation that all of that could bring. And of course, ahistoricism, the assumption of cross-cultural and transhistorical. And he thought that because a lot of models were founded on these 5 assumptions, that they did not respond to the questions of their reality, particularly of what he's talking about, right? These are folks that are growing up in war conditions. These are folks that didn't even have a childhood because they were growing up in war conditions. And then seeing people maybe just try to diagnose them with PTSD, and they weren't even post the trauma just yet because there was an active civil war going on. And so he just questioned a lot of, what is this doing, right? What are these models doing? And what kind of questions are they answering? And are they even connected to the lives of these people? So he wrote, to achieve a psychology of liberation demands first that psychology be liberated. So he said that there were 3 urgent tasks that needed to happen. Recovering historical memory, because he felt that many people in their provision of services were stuck in permanent psychological present. So again, teaching from an ahistorical and apolitical way, teaching from a upholding universalism, not being able to make connections between the micro experience to the macro level, but internationally as well and global. The recovering of historical memory is also about going into these collective memories and finding, and I think there's a lot of talk right now, right, about the erasure of people's histories, right? So this may resonate with a lot of you, that when you don't have these histories in the classroom, in the lesson planning, in the therapy room, in whatever it is you're doing, that you're also erasing the historical memories of change, right? What folks did to come together and change the conditions previously, because we can learn from that. So if we have access to these histories, we can recover, historical memory of protest, of change, of movement. We can learn from our ancestors what they did, right? And we can use that wisdom today. So he thought that was very urgent. No more apolitical, no more ahistorical. Yeah. So de-ideologizing, that's a hard word for me, everyday experiences. Again, deconstructing what common sense is, and is it common sense, and is it being manufactured, and how is it serving the people? So this is about retrieving the original experience of groups and persons and returning it to them as objective data to create a consciousness of their own reality. And we're going to talk about conscientización, which is critical consciousness raising, in a minute. And of course, utilizing people's virtues, all of the helpers. This should just resonate with you. It's about being strength-based. It's about asset mapping, that there is no reason to look elsewhere, that everything that is beautiful, that is resilient, that is intelligent, that is solutions, is within that group, right? It is within that group, and they have what it takes to be able to do this. And so let's look there. There's no need to export ideas and other cultural ways of being and other solutions from elsewhere. Let's look at the community, and the community can come up with solutions as well. Okay. So I cannot talk about conscientización, which is critical consciousness raising, without talking about how much Ignacio Martín Baro borrowed and learned from Paulo Freire. And I cannot talk about conscientización without mentioning Alberto Guerreiro Ramos, which is an Afro-Brazilian sociologist born in 1915, who actually coined the term conscientización. And so let me start there. Alberto Guerreiro Ramos, again, a Black Brazilian, born in 1915. He was shaped by his lived experience and by studying psychoanalysis, existentialist, particularly Christian existentialist and decolonial theories. So he was someone that studied Erich Fromm. He was someone that studied Freud. He was someone that studied Frantz Fanon. And he was just moved, I want to say in particular with Frantz Fanon's post-colonial theories around what it means to be Black within the realm of psychology. And so he actually developed, I guess, group therapy in the way of theater, right? So he had a theater group, and they would enact, some of these issues that we would call today intersectionality, but obviously multiple systems of oppression existing in one person, such as race and class. Obviously Paulo Freire, Alberto Guerreiro, Ignacio Martín Baro, they definitely had class consciousness in everything that they did and wrote and said. And so in one of those, theater groups and projects that Alberto Guerreiro Ramos did, he came up with the term conscientización. So when Freire learned about it, because they studied together, he said, when I heard this word for the first time, I immediately realized the profundity of its meaning. Freire remembered, because I have the strong conviction that education as praxis of liberty is knowledge action, that is a critical approach to reality. From then on, this word forms part of my own lexicon. Now, Freire was born in 1921. Part of what informed his work was his own lived experience. He was born into poverty, and he was hungry, right? Sometimes he didn't have food to eat. And so he experienced learning difficulties. And so that experience taught him, to recognize that he didn't have difficulties reading and writing. He was too hungry to learn how to read and appropriately and write and et cetera. And so it was really, really important for him to be able to bridge those connections of people deserve dignity and people deserve, so human rights, right, around that understanding of being able to thrive if everything is if people are safe and people are fed and people have housing and all of these things. So he lived through that informed what he ended up doing in Brazil, which was transformational, right? I have yet to come across a discipline that isn't impacted by Freire's work. So conscientización, it's understanding reality through a dialectical process. Ignacio Martín Baró wrote about the fact that some folks, particularly in North America, how we may struggle with uncertainty, and we may struggle with ambiguity, and we may struggle with holding multiple tensions in different conversations. And so, being the oppressor and oppressed, and just, being able to, through dialogue and questioning and discussion, unveiling these things. So unveiling systems of oppression brings new possibility, not only of what is at stake, what is happening and how it's shaping your life, but what is possible, unveiling all of these new possibilities. So there's a discovery of who they are and what they can become. So there's a question here in the bottom that says, so what are our roles, right? Are we using critical consciousness raising in the classroom? Are we using critical consciousness raising in an action plan, in a treatment plan, in the therapy room? How are we making these connections? And do we even consider this to be part of our roles? Because there's definitely a lot of folks out there that might say, well, that sounds just too political. And that sounds like it can get messy, and that, what am I supposed to do about systems oppressing entire groups of people? So some people might feel overwhelmed by these types of conversations, but these folks are saying that by unveiling all of these systems and having dialogue and having conversations, that this is going to maybe evoke, right, a new reality, a new personal understanding, a gaining of agency, and say, and students and patients and clients and the people that we serve, arriving at new rejections of scripts, right? So when I think about Latinx communities, I think about fatalismo, fatalism, which is something Ignacio Martín Baró wrote about. And it tends to sound like, and this, let me know if this resonates with you, but there's a lot of sayings, right? Everything happens for a reason. Así tenían que ser las cosas. Ya tú sabes, así son las cosas. Es lo que Dios quiso, right? It's what God wanted for us. And so there's a really strong clash between those concepts of fatalism, predetermined things, with agency and, no, I'm gonna use my voice, and I'm gonna use my body, and I'm gonna use my role in whatever it is that I'm doing to try to change that, right? And that's very powerful. So I'm gonna very briefly go through this and offer it to you as just an example of what I do with students. So you all know that obviously I teach social work, and there's many things that we do, right? We have to do assessments of individuals, groups, communities, organizations, but that, one of the things, so I'm going to think about an intake, for example, the ask here is to go beyond the traditional biopsychosocial and make room for all of the things that can help us understand maybe historical trauma, generational trauma, how oppression impacts and shows up, and what are the things that are happening to people. But I also want you to think not just at the micro level, but also internationally, right? Because when you're working with refugees, when you're working with asylum seekers, when you're working with people that have been displaced, many things have happened and can help us understand this from a human rights violation, from a poverty-aware paradigm. And this way we don't drop microaggressions, right? That say things like, well, maybe if you would study more, maybe if you would consider doing this, which places it all at the individual level. So the micro assessment is that, right? Some of the biopsychosocial things that you would get in a traditional intake, such as maybe previous diagnosis, family composition, how many years of schooling do you have, right? But then the rest of these, you want to inform your assessments and conceptualizations, and maybe even have interventions that discuss this. What are, culturally, what are the cultural messages around what has happened? And do that analysis, right? Where do you live? What is the common sense where you live? And how can we deconstruct all of this cultural messaging that is contributing to your presenting problems? You want to also do a structural analysis. What are the institutional factors that are contributing to your presenting problem, right? So if I'm talking to someone who suffers maybe from pain conditions, right? What are some of those cultural messages around pain conditions that may be exacerbating how you feel about what is happening? And then when I go to structural analysis, I may name the fact that we all don't have health insurance. And so how does the fact that if you don't have health insurance, how does that impact the presenting problem that you're saying? Again, whether it's in therapy, whether you're discussing cases in the classroom, you have to make room for the structural analysis and how that can play a role to the presentations that you're seeing. And historical, right? What is the history of this person in this country and the geopolitical factors that contributed to the presenting problem? And that also includes a global analysis. And, why do we have a historical and why do we need to have a global analysis? Because we need to name power. Who has power? What kind of power? What are they doing with it? And how is that showing up in the mental health, right? Or in the academic achievement of the people in front of you? So this is very brief, and it's because I've ran out of time. But these are all, the ask here is to include all of these alongside other multiple frameworks, including things like intersectionality, anti-oppressive, and just making room for the assessment, the conceptualization, and the treatment planning for all of these domains in someone's life. And I did have a video, but I'm not going to play it.
Are not just
And here we have Ignacio Martin Baro, and he was discussing all of the different atrocities that were being done in El Salvador in the name of the people, but definitely not from the people. And he said that even when you're speaking about very deep psychological problems, we're still talking about political problems. And that's it. Thank you so much for being here.
are not just shoes.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but if you can stick around for a quick Q&A session, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Thank you.